So here we're going into a reserve area, and so you can see they put up a protected barrier because they're moving back and forth with the boat, and so they're preventing that wave wash from going into the mangrove and disturbing the root systems. And here you can see the root systems that are coming up to get air, and then some of the trees that are growing in the mangrove. You can see some of the leaves. So this is one of the mangrove species, the white mangrove. So it's kind of a combination of different species. We have the white mangrove, the red mangrove, and the black mangrove here. And these areas are rich in wildlife, rich in biodiversity. And here you can see a coati searching through the different material in the biological reserve. And they're just very rich in all sorts of different species. Coatis and different species need a certain amount of food so that they can survive in those areas. And here you can see the mangrove moving from the stem all the way down. And so they're sending these root systems down into the water to get water, but they're also using for support. So they're using it as a support system, and they can also spread themselves. So it roots down and then it can produce another whole tree. And so it kind of moves in that fashion, constantly moving out. You'll see that many of the mangroves has this typical stilting look to it. It looks like little feet, and the tree is actually keeping itself out of the water because the salt water damages its tissues, and it has to have methods of keeping itself out. Here you can see the different vegetative propagules that are used, so you can actually harvest those little tubers, those little vegetative propagules. They're about yay long, and the tip, when they fall down, they actually stick into the ground when they fall down, and then a new little seedling can start growing. So it's a way, and they can also, because they're buoyant, they float around for long distances, and eventually they stick into the mud, and then they can start to grow. And so it's a method of moving the things around, and that's one of the propagules that's really important for restoring the mangrove, because it's very easy to pick all those little propagules off the tree, stick them in the mud, and then they grow. So I'm out in the mangrove today, and you can see here's the typical mangrove tree, and then the root system is coming up, and it's more aerial. So it's actually the water is very close to the surface, and then it has these aerial roots, so it allows the tree to live out of the water rather than in where it's going to be more anoxic. So you can see there's some sort of disturbances going on here, and restoring this ecosystem is really important because there's a lot of biodiversity here. So this is part of a nature reserve, or a mangrove nature reserve, and so they've created paths here, and they've created protections so that it minimizes the impact from the tourists, because there's a lot of tourists that want to look at these different areas, and so they're protecting the waterway. And you can see these clear blue areas are actually areas where there's upwellings of clean water that's coming out of the groundwater. And so we need to protect these areas, and they're protecting them from the tourists. Some of the tourists will go into the water and use it as a bit of a swimming hole, so they're making a little bit of an income from this. But they're also being very careful about not bringing food in and protecting the wildlife that are here, so that the ecosystem remains intact rather than being hit with all this pressure from all the different tourists. So they're having a certain area where they're allowing tourists to come in, but then off the trails they're very much protected. And so you have a larger area of protected mangrove, and because it's valued, then it's going to be treated with more respect. So some of these trees have vegetative propagules, and these are actually very easy to plant and to restore into a wetland ecosystem. So either you can take these and just push them right into the mud, and then they'll start growing, and you can see how that happens right here. So these are basically just falling out of the tree and they land on the ground, and it's got this point, and so it just hits the ground and sticks in, and then very quickly it starts growing, and so you have all these different seedlings that are growing here, and so it makes for a fairly rapid restoration technique for restoring mangroves. And you can just harvest all these little tubers, these little propagules, they're vegetative propagules, and take them out into the marsh, into the places that have unconsolidated soil or areas that have been damaged, and very quickly you can restore the marsh in areas that have low moving water. And you can see how all the roots are intertwined together, and how it's going to reduce the amount of wave action that's coming off of the ocean, so that it's consolidated together and it's really holding the soil down. And so all these root systems are linking together and holding, you know, it is a sandy substrate underneath, but it's holding that. It's putting a lot of organic matter into the soil, and really making this a rich environment. So originally it was sand on the shoreline, and then as the water is moving off the land, it's moving the sediment as well, and you can see the accumulation of biomass that's occurring just because the mangroves here. Unfortunately, you know, you get tourist operations that don't care as much about these areas, and so they clear everything off because they want the beach, and they want to see the sand, and they want to be able to see the water, and so they clean everything off. And there's other groups that are, you know, they want the wood, and so they're cutting the wood. So here you can see an area that's been damaged either by a storm or by some of the changes in hydrology, and changes in hydrology are a major impact on these mangrove ecosystems. Normally you have the water moving back and forth through the system very easily, and over time it starts to fill up. But then if you have things like roads or different things like that stop the movement of water, then that flushing in and out of nutrients stops happening, and so you can get buildups of salt in certain areas, or else it can become too much fresh water in certain areas, or just not having that movement of nutrients back and forth can really impact this whole ecosystem. You can also get hurricanes and different things that damage the plants, and so then you want to go back in there and restore. You want to restore the hydrology first, make sure that the hydrology is still good and that there's a good flow of water in and out of the mangrove ecosystem. And then just looking across the landscape, you can see it's fairly flat, but then there's different pockets that are a little bit shallower. There will be some areas where there's water movements, where there'll be more fish. And so just looking at the landscape and figuring out where things are going. A lot of times what they're doing now to restore mangroves is returning the hydrology. They're actually digging channels, because a lot of the road systems that they put a culvert underneath, but those culverts fill in fairly quickly, and then they need to go back in there and clean out those culverts so that it has that movement of water. And something simple like that, or even just putting some channels into the mangroves so that it has that renewal of nutrients and water movement, so that it's not stagnant anymore, is really important for maintaining the mangrove. Mexico is blessed with many mangroves, so both coasts, both the Gulf of Mexico and all around, and then into the other side where it has coral reefs and seagrass communities as well. So there's tons of mangroves all around Mexico. A lot of them have been damaged or degraded, and so reserves like this are really important for protecting the mangroves. And there's large protected areas like Celestun where the mangroves are being protected, and things like flamingos, which are dependent on the mangrove ecosystem. need these big areas of mangrove, and so do all the fish and different creatures that they're eating. So here you can see the mangrove coming down, and these aerial roots are actually dripping down from the branches and going into the water. And if you look in the water, you can see that there's tons of fish. And this is why mangroves are really important for protecting, because this is a nursery area for different fish. So there's all sorts of different species of fish in here, and they lay their eggs in these areas. They have live birth for different fish, and it's a nursery area so that when they go out, they can go out into the different areas. And you can see that over here there's a little turtle. So even turtles are out here. And all this fresh water, we're right beside the ocean, but all this fresh water is moving off of the land, coming out of the groundwater, and there's an upwelling in this area. And so it allows for these mangrove species to occur in this area. Here you can see an area that's been damaged by some sort of a change in hydrology probably, and so a lot of the trees have died in this particular spot, but then there's regeneration starting to happen of the mangrove, and different trees are starting to pop up in different vegetation, but you can see that most of the trees in this little spot here have died back. So just taking that into consideration when you're trying to restore an ecosystem, not only do you have to maintain the plants, but you also have to maintain the hydrology, or else, areas that are healthy could be damaged and killed off. Obviously, different species are coming in to take over from those species that have died, and eventually it'll regenerate itself. So this is kind of a gap that's being filled in the mangrove over time. And so this is the process that you need to consider when you're doing an ecological restoration. What is that fluctuation, and do I have enough species in there? I'm not just planting one monoculture of one species because it's easy to plant. You need to put in all the different species, because obviously the hydrology changed here, and now other species are coming in to replace those trees. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support keeps these videos free for everyone.